I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. Catherine Webster headed for her fate at the gallows at Wandsworth Prison on July 29, 1879. She would quickly hang and take her title as one of the most despised criminals in England's history. She was the emblem of female malice in Victorian England in the late 19th century. What was her crime? Maybe it started with being poor, but it ended with the murder, dismemberment, cooking, and disposal of her employer, Julia Martha Thomas. But stay tuned, because though I've given you the punchline in the intro, there is still much to be learned.
Because we have hopped the pond for this crime, we had to do a British-inspired margarita. Pimms is known as a Britain's favorite summer drink. So, even more perfect for a June margarita. For this relatively simple drink, we're actually going to do one part of everything. We'll make a small sipping margarita for today's crime. So we started with 1 part Pimms. Now we're going to add 1 part simple syrup, 1 part tequila, and we will wrap it up with 1 part lime juice. Ooh. We will shake our shaker, which has ice in it, cools the margarita, as well as combining the ingredients. You all know this by now. We strain, as the bougie British would do, of course, over fresh ice. Ooh, that's pretty. For this drink, we're using a salt-rimmed glass.
Catherine Webster was born Catherine Lalla in Wexford County in Ireland in about 1849. Her family was poor, but well respected within the community. As a child, Kate was caught stealing on numerous occasions, including from her classmates. She was known to be dishonest. She went to prison for larceny, or theft, in 1864 in Wexford County when she was about 15 years old. Upon her release, she was able to steal enough money to buy a train ticket to England, Liverpool, in 1867. Beyond that, relatively little is known about her early years. At one point, she claimed to have been married to a sea captain with the last name of Webster, and she claimed to have had 4 children with him. She said that all 4 children and the husband had died. It's not really proven one way or another whether or not this is true, but considering Kate's age and her propensity for lying, this is most likely untrue. In February of 1868, she was again caught stealing and charged with larceny and served another 4 years in prison. Kate was about 5 foot 5 inches tall, with an unhealthy-looking, freckled complexion and large teeth. She also photographed looking real wild in the eyes. After her release, she moved to West London, where she operated under a variety of aliases. This included Webb, Webster, Gibb, Gibbons, and Lawler. 2 years after her release from prison, she gave birth to a son, whom she named John W. Webster. She wouldn't have much time for him in his early years, as she was arrested just 1 year after he was born, again for larceny in 1875. She was then arrested in February 1877 for the exact same charge. My first thought was that she must not have been very good at stealing, but probably what it actually was is that she stole a ton of money all the time, and this was just the few times that she got caught. Her son was cared for mostly by one of her friends, as Kate spent a lot of time in prison, and she didn't really say who the father was, claiming it was 3 different men at different times. Julia Martha Thomas was a former schoolteacher who was twice widowed. Since her death of her second husband in 1873, she had lived alone. Her house was a quiet 2-story villa in an area that didn't have much going on except for a pub down the road called the Hole in the Wall. Julia was known to be a very small and petite woman and was around 54 years old. She was always known to be dressed to the nines, even though she was really part of the lower middle class. Her fancy dress and jewelry allowed her a facade of wealth. Many saw her as eccentric. She was known to often leave and travel for months at a time without telling anyone. This was, as you can imagine, pretty unusual for the time. And, as was customary for the time, Julia had a live-in maid. She had a reputation, however, for being quite a harsh employer, and that, combined with her eccentric ways, meant it was pretty hard for her to maintain anyone in her employment for a long period of time. A neighbor of Julia's had actually hired Kate as temporary help while her servant was ill. So the neighbor recommended Kate to Julia. When Julia met Kate, she hired her on the spot. And I think it goes without saying that she didn't really do any background checking on Kate to maybe discover that she was a, 4-time convicted criminal. But anyway, on January 29th, 1879, Julia took Kate on as a live-in servant. Important to note that this was a live-in position, 6.5 days a week with only a half day off on Sundays. I have no idea where Kate's son lived. I guess with that friend? I don't know. It seems that the working relationship between the two women crumbled almost immediately. Julia did not approve of the quality of work done by Kate, and later Kate would say, quote, "At first I thought her a nice old lady, but I found her very trying, and she used to do many things to annoy me during my work. When I had finished my work in my rooms, she used to go over it again after me and point out places where she said I did not clean, showing evidence of a nasty spirit towards me." End quote. Seemed like the hatred might have gone both ways. At one point, Julia actually tried to get some of her friends to stay with her because she really didn't like staying in the house with Kate alone, and perhaps was worried about what Kate might do. It was evident that things were not working out, and Julia fired Kate, letting her know that her last day of work would be just a month after she started, February 28th. In her final diary entry, Julia wrote, "Gave Catherine warning to leave." Kate evidently persuaded Julia to let her stay on for 3 more days, making her last day of work Sunday, March 2nd. Kate took her regularly scheduled half day off on Sunday, and although she was supposed to return in time to help Julia prepare to go to the evening services at the Presbyterian Church, Kate spent a little bit too much time in the afternoon at the Hole in the Wall, and she made Julia late for church. The women had an argument, and upon arrival at church, the fellow parishioners noticed that Julia seemed agitated. She seemed to have a frustrated attitude, and she even left church early that night. She got home around 9 p.m., which, man, if that's early, that's a lot of church. That was the second service she went to that day. Anyway, once Julia got home, she headed upstairs and Kate followed her. The argument from before continued, which I for one think is weird because it was Kate's last day of work and actually who cares, but they kept fighting. In the heat of the moment, Kate, who was taller and stronger than Julia, quote, "threw her from the top of the stairs to the ground floor," end quote. Quite a strong woman, I'd say. Kate then ran down the stairs and finished the job by choking her to death. The neighbors happened to hear a thump, which was probably Julia hitting the ground floor, but for some reason they thought that it was just a chair that had fallen over in the neighbor's house. One option, upon realizing that you'd killed your employer, might be to, run away. Evidently, this wasn't the first, second, or third idea that Kate had. The first idea, inexplicably, was to drag Julia's body into the kitchen and dismember it. By the way, dismemberment is a universal excuse to drain your margarita into you and to make yourself a new one. I'll wait. She dismembered Julia's body into several parts. I'm not going to go into details. I'm so sorry, because then she, like the soap maker of Correggio, put those parts into pots and then inexplicably starts to cook them. This was the same copper pot that they used to clean the laundry. By the way, boiling body parts, another excuse to drain the margarita into yourself and make another one. I'll wait. After that, she attempted to burn whatever bones were still existent in the hearth. The neighbors, who I'm realizing were the exact opposite of nosy, began to discover an absolutely terrible smell coming from Julia's house. But again, they did nothing. Kate was also overcome by the smell and left the house and headed over to the hole in the wall to grab a drink or 10. Can't say that I blame her. Well, actually, I do blame her. She spent the next couple of days generally acting like a maid and cleaning the house in a normal fashion and also cleaning up after a murder, meanwhile packing the remains of her former employer into a bag and a bonnet box. She was able to get all the parts of the body into those two things except for one foot and a head. So she threw the foot in a rubbish pile and then buried the head in the stables of her favorite pub, the Hole in the Wall. Also, legend has it that she sold some of the fat she made from Julia to some of the pub goers. I do not know why this keeps happening. And then to make herself seem even worse later, she started wearing Julia's clothes, visiting some old friends, and carrying around those bags and boxes with her former employer's remains inside of them. She went with them to a pub and on the way tossed the bag into the Thames River. The bag would never be recovered. Later on, she asked one of her friends to help her carry a heavy bonnet box to the train station, but on the way instead just tossed that bonnet box also into the Thames River. This somehow did not arouse suspicion with her friend. Maybe this has something to do with the Victorian era. I don't know. The bonnet box, however, did not do a great job of sinking and was discovered the next day by a coal porter. Opening it to reveal its grisly contents, he immediately took it to a police station. Around the same time, a random human foot and ankle were found in the river. It became obvious that these body parts belonged to the same body. But because we're talking about the late 19th century here, there wasn't really any way to identify the body. The unidentified remains were buried in Barnes Cemetery on March 19th. 2 weeks after the murder. Kate, by this point, just decided that she was going to permanently live in Julia's house, wearing her clothes and going by the name Mrs. Thomas, widow. But then she decided to start selling Julia's furniture. Apparently, selling furniture ends up being her downfall. Finally, when the furniture starts leaving the house, the neighbors become suspicious enough to start actually asking what the heck is going on. Her next door neighbor asked the delivery man who had ordered the furniture removed, and the delivery man replied, Mrs. Thomas, and points directly at Kate. That was a woman who her next door neighbor knew was most decidedly not Mrs. Thomas. So Kate finally, at this point, flees. She heads straight back to Ireland with her son, and now the neighbors call the authorities. They search the house, finding blood. Evidently, Kate wasn't actually that good of a house cleaner. Evidence of bones, finger bones in the fireplace, and fat behind the copper pot. They also discover a letter that displays Kate's address in Ireland. The investigators traced Kate to her uncle's farm and arrested her on March 29th. She was transported back to England by Scotland Yard. Her uncle refused to care for her son, so he was sent to a local workyard. Nice. After her arrest, she first claimed that the death was accidental. They had been arguing, and Mrs. Thomas slipped and fell and I guess choked on her own spit. As was to be expected, the murder and arrest was a sensation in England and in Ireland. The house, as is most ridiculously commonplace knowledge by now, became a tourist destination, and people would often come and grab twigs and rocks from the courtyard as souvenirs. The trial itself was a spectacle. It began on July 2nd, 1879, and many curiosity seekers attended the trial, including, as was very uncustomary at the time, women. Also, randomly, The Crown Prince of Sweden showed up to the trial to witness what was happening on the fourth day. Everyone was excited to witness the trial of the Maid gone wild. Maids were supposed to be good, quiet, do exactly what their employers said to do, with a smile on their face. The trial itself lasted 6 days. She pled not guilty, and her lawyers used all the evidence is circumstantial defense. Which, I mean, kind of, but like she was wearing her employer's clothes, selling furniture out of her house where there were finger bones in the fireplace, but okay. But man, people hated Kate. She appeared nonplussed at the trial, just totally could not be bothered. And there was just something about a maid killing a lady that really got under people's skin. That, with a pretty pathetic defense, left her as pretty much the most unpopular defendant in criminal history, if that's a contest. A witness attested to Kate claiming to her a week before the murders that she was going to have some jewelry to sell, really showing some premeditation. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and the judge moved to the sentencing of Kate Webster. He asked if there was any reason why she shouldn't be put to death, and she exclaimed, "I'm pregnant!" Evidently, this would have spared her the death penalty, at least for a little while, but the court did one of the oddest things I've ever heard of to determine if she was actually pregnant. They gathered 12 women who were mostly audience members of the trial and a surgeon, and swore them all in together, and then had them take Kate into another room to examine if she was pregnant. I'm not really sure how 12 random women could decide that, but whatever. Also, 12 random women attending the trial probably aren't going to be unbiased in this situation, but again, whatever. They all determined that she wasn't, quote, quick with child, unquote, which evidently doesn't mean that she wasn't pregnant, but she wasn't far enough along in her pregnancy for it to matter, at least in the eyes of the court. Kate submitted one appeal a few days before the execution, but the appeal was denied. And the night before the execution, Kate confessed. That's how we know all the details from the crime and the details of what happened afterwards. She told exactly what happened to sour their relationship, what had happened the night of the murder, what had happened in the days after, and what she had done to dispose of the body. She was executed on July 29th at 9:00 a.m. using a newly developed long drop technique in her hanging. This evidently caused an instant death. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a prison exercise yard. As was customary at the time, a black flag was raised over the walls of the prison. People outside cheered. Julia's household and personal possessions were auctioned off the following day. The copper pot where she had been boiled was sold for 5 shillings, and the knife that had been used to kill her was also auctioned off. No one would live in the house for 20 years following the murder for obvious reasons, and so it remained unoccupied until 1897. Kate was immediately and easily the most infamous woman in England. People hated that she wasn't the typical woman of the era almost as much as they hated that she was a murderer. Madame Tussaud created a wax statue of her before the trial had even begun, and she was on display labeled as the Richmond Murderess well into the 1900s. You could find her in the Chamber of Horrors. Almost immediately after her execution, you could buy a souvenir booklet titled The Life, Trial, and Execution of Kate Webster. It would cost you a penny. It would take you all the way through the whole life story of Kate, right up to them putting lime in her coffin. As was pretty common at the time, murder ballads were written and sung, telling the tale of Julia Thomas and Kate Webster. One of my favorites has a couple of good lines. The terrible crime at Richmond at last on Catherine Webster now has been cast. Tried and found guilty, she is sentenced to die. From the strong hand of justice, she cannot fly. In my opinion, this is a textbook case of a crime of passion. Kate was angry that she was being fired, and she was worried because she didn't know how she was going to support herself or her young son. Julia was obviously no picnic to work for, but Kate needed the work. The firing and then the fighting just escalated and to the point where Kate just couldn't handle herself anymore. It was a tragic decision in the heat of the moment. I don't think she was a hardened criminal with a murderous mentality, much like the London press would have you believe. She stole to support herself in an era where it was almost impossible for women to make a living by themselves. She killed because she felt helpless and angry, and things just got out of control. Now, what she did afterwards, woof. It does seem like this is a trend we're discovering with people who kill in the heat of passion. Cook the body to get rid of it! Well, if you were wondering, that doesn't work. So what do you think? Was Kate a cold, hard criminal who was bound to commit murder? Or was this a crime of passion? How come her uncle was such a jerk in not agreeing to care for her son upon Kate's arrest? The son didn't do anything wrong. Why do all of these crimes in the 1800s end with people heading to the crime scene to take souvenirs? Is there a 21st century equivalent? Do you think you would be into true crime if you lived back then? Would you attend a trial for someone that you didn't know just for the entertainment value? And how do you feel about the crowds cheering for Kate's death after she was executed? How do you feel about a pub surviving for well over 100 years? Ooh, more on that in a second. The cottage that Jane owned still stands today. In 1952, bought a cottage with his wife that just so happens to sit between Jane's villa and the hole-in-the-wall pub. That pub actually stayed in business until 2007. And in 2009, Sir Attenborough bought the pub to redevelop it. On October 22nd, 2010, workmen at the pub uncovered a woman's skull. An investigation began to discover the identity of the skull, though it was suspected to be Julia Thomas's almost right away. Carbon dating dated the skull to within the era of Julia's lifetime, and the combination of low collagen levels, which would have occurred if the head had been boiled, and fracture marks consistent with a fall down the stairs, led investigators to the conclusion that the skull did belong to Julia Martha Thomas. The last of Julia's remains was found at last, and was buried in an unmarked grave in 2011. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you're enjoying Margs and Mayhem. And if you are, I hope you'll show that love with a thumbs up or a subscribe or even a review if you'd like. I'm always looking for margarita recipes. We're actually using 2 this month from listeners of the podcast. And I'm always looking for case recommendations, especially those that are a little more unusual and haven't been covered by podcasters or YouTubers yet. If you have an idea for one of these things, please head to the Margs and Mayhem social media and drop a comment there, or you can always shoot me a DM. Next week, we head back to my home state of Kansas to explore one of the rarest types of killers, a whole family of serial killers. They murdered together for years. Man, everybody got away with everything in the 19th century. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murdering your boss.